I've audited hundreds of fraudulent statements. But I never thought I'd be the victim of a single text message. That afternoon, I was ironing a silver-gray dress shirt, the collar still creased from the last time I'd worn it. It was the shirt I wore to my son, Eric's wedding 10 years ago. The only shirt my granddaughter, Julia, had ever complimented. "Grandpa," she'd said, "you look like a news anchor." I carefully set the iron aside, adjusted the buttons, and laid out the leather belt I kept hanging on the door. Tonight was the first dinner at Eric and his wife's new house. The house I'd bought for them at a bank auction using nearly 70% of my life savings. He had called it an investment in the family's future. I had just checked my watch, 6:05 p.m., when my phone buzzed. A text from Eric: "Dad, we have to cancel tonight. Change of plans." I frowned. Just yesterday he'd texted 7 p.m., "Dad, don't forget. I have something special I want to tell you." I was about to reply when a second message came through. This one wasn't so polite. "Vanessa doesn't want you to come." I stood perfectly still. Not angry, not even surprised. Just still. Back when I was an investigator, I used to say, the motive is rarely in the first sentence, it's in the second. And that sentence, "Vanessa doesn't want you to come," was the moment the mask fell. I didn't bother changing. I folded the shirt and hung it back up. I walked straight into my study and opened the left-hand drawer of my oak desk, the one where I keep the family's financial records. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I just wanted to check, to see how much evidence I'd never used. I flipped through the receipts, the payment for the SUV Vanessa bought in 2021, $58,000. I covered almost all of it. The invoice for Julia's freshman year of college, $32,000 wired overnight. The receipt for the open concept kitchen remodel, $18,400. And the supplementary credit card, in my name, that Vanessa still swiped for every emergency. I've handled fraud cases 100 times more complex than this. But I'd never seen anyone spend money the way I did, just hoping to be accepted as part of the family. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a thick black ledger, the expense tracker I'd been using since 1978. I counted 174 transfers over the last 9 years. The notes were clear tuition support, new car for Vanessa house down payment, winter furnace repair. Not once was there a note that said repaid. Not once could I remember my son asking, "Dad, do you have enough to live on?" I took a pair of scissors and cut the ledger in half. A clean cut. My hand didn't shake. Next, Vanessa's supplementary credit card. I snapped it in two. Then I called the bank. "I'd like to cancel all automatic payments, and I want to remove the authorized user from my account, sir." "Are you sure there are 174 active debits?" "I'm sure. And I'd like to speak with your legal department tomorrow morning." My voice was as calm as if I were ordering coffee with less sugar. I didn't raise it. I didn't repeat myself. I hung up. I sat back down. The light from the porch was beginning to change from honey gold to lead gray. For the first time in years, I felt a weight lift from my chest. It was like taking off a backpack full of rocks I'd forgotten I was even carrying. Every man has his limit. Mine wasn't the amount of money I'd spent. It was the text message telling me I was no longer welcome in the very house I had bought for them. I didn't say a word that day, but I started to act. Quietly, methodically, and with absolute certainty. The next morning, I went to my old bank branch on the corner of Main Street, the same one where I opened my first account in 1983, right after I took the auditing job with the state. The tellers had changed, but the atmosphere was the same. The smell of paper, the moss green carpet, and the rhythmic clicking of a dot matrix printer, as if the 90s had never ended. I met with Jane, who had managed my accounts for the last 12 years. She was 30 years my junior, but knew my signature and transaction habits better than my own son did. "Mr. Quinn, She said, her voice as soft as if she were discussing the weather. I'm guessing today's the day you turn off the tap? Not turning off the tap, Jane, I said. I'm shutting the windows before the whole house gets blown away. I requested a full statement of all transactions linked to Eric or Vanessa for the past 3 years. I wasn't surprised. But a cold dread still washed over me as I saw the numbers lined up like soldiers on the page. A deposit for Julia's private school tuition, $11,200. A transfer for Vanessa's mother's medical expenses, $600 to $800. I remember clearly, she passed away in 2015. A Thanksgiving cash withdrawal, $3,000. I had dinner alone that year. A deposit to a restaurant for Vanessa's birthday party, $2,100. I wasn't invited. But the most damning evidence was 4 transfers to a sub-account opened in my name that I never authorized. Total value, $47,000. Who set this account up, I asked. Jane frowned, looking at her screen. It was set up online, opened with secondary access from your main account. But the IP address is from 418 Meadow Lane, where Eric and his wife live. I nodded. I left the bank at 9:35 a.m., holding a triplicate copy of the report, one for analysis, one for evidence, and one to remember the last time I was treated like a father. Back home, I laid the documents on my desk and brewed a pot of strong black coffee. No sugar, no cream. Exactly how I faced the truth without softening the blow. I opened a file, took out a pen and paper, and began to map out the family's entire financial network, from 2016 to the present, just like a state-level investigation. Every arrow was a relationship. Every dot was an instance of exploitation. Every red line was a cut into my trust. I don't need hidden cameras. I don't need audio recordings. All I need is the one thing they never thought I'd check: the transaction history. And I had it. Complete. To audit-level standards. The whole world could lie, but the numbers couldn't. The day I stopped sending money was the day I started taking myself back. But the day I first suspected my son had forged my identity was the day I stopped thinking of him as family. He became something else, an unauthorized user on my account. I called Grant Sullivan at 10 a.m. Grant is an asset protection attorney, one of my former students from my days as a consulting auditor for the Wexford Group. He used to joke with me, "Sir, if you ever sued me, I wouldn't stand a chance." Mr. Quinn, I'm guessing you finally need a lawyer, not a financial advisor. Grant, I said they didn't just spend my money. They started forging my identity to take out loans. The line went silent for 3 full beats. Then Grant replied, "My office, tomorrow morning. Bring everything." The next day, I brought Grant. 3 years of bank statements. The confirmation that the fraudulent account was opened from Eric's IP address. A history of all unusual payments. Copies of the signatures I suspected were forged. I presented my case with the same detached clarity I used when I reported a money laundering scheme to an Illinois federal judge in 1992. No emotion, no outrage. Just facts. Grant didn't say much. He just took notes like a machine. "We have 3 things to do," Grant said finally. 1, set up an irrevocable trust. 2, transfer all your assets into it. 3, amend your will and remove anyone who could exploit their inheritance. And he added, his voice firm, "If you want to, we can file a legal inquiry into the account forgery. That's a federal offense." I nodded. That afternoon, I sat alone reviewing every asset: the house, my retirement accounts, the Johnson & Waverly stock I bought in 1995. My remaining shares in my old firm, and the savings account I'd opened in case Julia wants to go to grad school. I gathered it all. And for the first time in my life, the name Eric appeared on none of it. Not out of anger. but because I no longer considered him my heir. That evening, I didn't turn on the TV. I took out a small notebook and wrote a single sentence they thought I would do nothing. I am doing something step by step. The difference between a sweet old man and a dangerous one is whether he's willing to sit back and let his identity and trust be stolen. I had been sitting long enough. It was time to stand up and reclaim what was mine without asking for permission. I was peeling an apple when I heard a car brake sharply in front of my gate. I didn't need to look. It was the sputtering engine of Eric's car, the sound of a worn-out motor and an uneven idle. I didn't get up. I set the knife on the wooden tray, wiped my hands and sat back down. He didn't knock. He just opened the door and walked in, as if he still believed this house was an extension of his own. "Dad, I need to talk." I just turned my head. "Sit." He sat in the chair across from my kitchen table. He wouldn't meet my eyes. His hands were clenched, his gaze fixed on the tile floor as if awaiting a verdict. "Vanessa and I, we're in trouble. You already know, don't you?" I didn't nod. I didn't shake my head. I just poured tea. One cup for me, one placed diagonally from him. Not an invitation, but not pushed away either. The bank called. They said the payments are frozen. If we can't come up with the money this week, they're going to foreclose on the house. I stirred my tea, my hand perfectly steady. Vanessa's card was declined too. She's a wreck. Julia's gone quiet. The silence stretched out, spreading like a water stain on concrete. I looked at him. No judgment. Just waiting for the automatic response of someone who has just lost control. "Can you turn the payments back on, just for a few months, so we can get back on our feet?" I set my spoon down on the saucer. "Eric, do you remember who paid for most of the house?" He nodded slowly. "Vanessa's car, do you remember who made the first transfer?" He nodded again, his head still bowed. "The new kitchen, Julia's tuition, the Hawaii vacation last summer, you two didn't invite me on. Do you know who paid for all of it?" A nod. But this time it was hesitant. I rested my hands on the table. Not a threat, just a reminder. You thought you needed a father, but what you really needed was your father's bank account. Eric looked up. His eyes were red, but there wasn't a single tear. We didn't think it would come to this." My lips curled, not a smile, but the faint smirk an auditor makes when he hears a suspect's first lie. "No, you didn't think I would react." I stood up and poured myself more tea. The other cup remained untouched. "You didn't come here to apologize. You came because you know I'm the only one who can save you. But this time, I no longer want to be the savior. When someone comes to you not out of remorse, but out of desperation, you don't have to refuse them with words. You just have to stop being the well they can draw from." That afternoon, I saw 3 unfamiliar cars parked at my gate. One was Vanessa's SUV. Another was an old Camry, her sister's, I guessed. The third was a pickup truck, a stranger, but with the posture of someone who'd come along to bear witness. I didn't answer the door right away. I stood behind the curtain, a silent observer. Only when the bell rang did I move. Not quickly, not slowly. I didn't invite them in. I just opened the door and turned away. Vanessa spoke first. "Mr. Quinn, we're here today because this family needs to have a frank conversation with witnesses." I turned back. "Witnesses or a jury?" She didn't answer. She just pulled out a chair and sat in the middle of my living room as if she owned the place. Eric sat beside her, unable to look at me. Julia sat the farthest away, her purse clutched tightly in her lap, her eyes avoiding everyone and everything. "We know you're angry," Vanessa said. "But your sudden financial cutoff has caused this family serious harm. So today, I brought a document to make things clear. She pulled a laminated paper from her purse and placed it on the table. This is the power of attorney you signed authorizing Eric and me to manage your assets in the event of your incapacitation. I didn't touch the paper. I just glanced at the signature, faded blurry and not in my handwriting. It wasn't Harold Quinn's signature. It was a scanned copy from an old document repurposed. And now we want you to sign the deed transfer for the house as we agreed. I didn't respond, because right at that moment, the doorbell rang a second time. I stood up and opened it. Grant Sullivan walked in dark suit leather briefcase and followed by another man in business attire with sharp, cold eyes. No introduction was needed. He radiated the unmistakable air of legal counsel. Vanessa recoiled. "Who is this? I'm Mr. Quinn's attorney," Grant said, his voice clear and steady. "And we're here for our scheduled appointment. I invited them in." The dynamic in the room had shifted. It was no longer a family demand, but an old man who had just revealed his hand. Grant took a file from his briefcase. The legal document establishing an irrevocable trust with me as the sole lifetime beneficiary. The new will with Eric and Vanessa's names completely removed. The bank's official signature verification records. And a file confirming an act of legal document forgery enough to press criminal charges. Grant looked directly at Vanessa. "You have just presented a document containing a forged signature. Under state law, this constitutes organized fraud. If Mr. Quinn chooses, we will proceed with a lawsuit for forgery and felony elder abuse." The oxygen seemed to vanish from the room. Vanessa's face went pale. Eric slumped in his chair. Julia gripped her purse tighter. I stood up and opened the front door wide. "I don't need to win against anyone," I said. "I just need to stop being stepped on. And with what you brought here today, you've given me every reason to close this door, not just my heart." I pointed outside. "Get out of my house. People only dare to pressure you when they think you have no one in your corner. But all it takes is one lawyer standing behind you at the right moment. And every conspiracy becomes a farce." 3 days after the family trial, I received a handwritten letter from Vanessa herself in a round looping script with sea blue ink. The envelope simply said, "From your daughter-in-law, I hope you'll give our family a chance." I didn't open it right away. I made tea first, sat at my desk, and turned on the soft yellow lamp. Then I used a letter opener as carefully as if I were unsealing a confidential audit file. Inside were 2 things. 1, a 2-page letter about family love, about the pressures a woman carries as a daughter-in-law, about the sadness of seeing Julia grow distant. 2, a small folder labeled "Proposal for Asset Transfer Notarized." The letter was skillfully written, so skillful that I let out a small laugh when I read the line, "If you ever loved me as part of your family, I hope you'll sign this so our family can find stability again." Attached was a deed transfer for the house, along with a copy of a medical letter confirming my diminished mental capacity, signed by our family doctor, who had retired in 2021. I opened my laptop. I typed in the doctor's name. The search result: he had passed away in March of last year. Vanessa didn't know, and that was her mistake. I called Grant. "Can you stop by this afternoon? I have a letter I need you to see." When Grant arrived, I handed him the entire package. He read it silently, without a frown or a furrowed brow. But when he got to the medical confirmation, he paused. "They used a deceased doctor's name. We can take this a step further." "Criminal?" I asked. "Organized fraud, forgery of medical documents, and intentional deception to acquire assets from an elderly person. This is enough to elevate it to the federal level." I didn't speak. I just poured us each a glass of scotch, the Glenlivet I'd saved since my wife Eleanor was alive. Sir, if you agree, I will send a formal letter notifying them of our intent to sue. I'll also contact the local authorities. I nodded. Not for revenge, but to make one thing clear, I am not a money tree that doesn't know how to pull out its own poisoned roots. When someone thinks you're too senile to read between the lines, that's the moment you can expose every layer of their deceit with a single signature, the one on a legal complaint. On Thursday night, I was reviewing my savings ledgers when I heard a knock at the door. It was soft too, even taps the knock of someone who isn't sure they're welcome, but still holds out hope. I opened the door. It was Julia. Her eyes were sunken, her jacket was thin, and her hair was tied back in a hasty bun. "Grandpa, can we talk?" I nodded, stepping aside to let her in. She didn't ask for anything. No hug, no pretense. She just sat in the chair opposite me and placed a folded piece of paper on the table, pressed flat, not crumpled. I've had this for almost a year. I unfolded it. It was a copy of a bank loan agreement for nearly $90,000. The guarantor was clearly listed, Harold Quinn. The attached signature, I recognized it immediately, was my old signature from a 2003 hospital record. I saw it in Mom's email. I thought it was a mistake at first. But then I found out. They took your old archived records, scanned them, and used them to apply for the loan. I said nothing. Julia continued. They didn't tell me, but I overheard them once. Mom said, as long as he doesn't notice, we can keep this going for a few more years. I clenched my fist, not in anger, but because every suspicion I had was just confirmed. Living proof delivered by one of their own. "I'm sorry," Julia said, her voice small. I was scared. Scared that if I said anything, they'd cut me off from you. But now, I don't want to live with the lies anymore. I placed my hand on the paper and looked at Julia. You don't have to be sorry, because you are not like them. She lowered her head, her shoulders trembling slightly. Are you mad at me for being quiet for so long? I shook my head. No, but I am sorry. Because the burden shouldn't have fallen on the only child who still knew the difference between right and wrong. That night, I scanned the entire loan agreement. I saved 3 copies, one for Grant, one for the bank, and one I printed out and left on my desk to remind myself that betrayal is sometimes signed with your own handwriting. When the only person telling the truth is the youngest one in the room, the adults are no longer adults. They are just old children in cloaks of false morality. On Monday morning, I was at Grant's office at 8:45 a.m. He had just finished brewing coffee, but before he could pour a cup, he saw me open my briefcase and lay out on his desk the forged loan application, Julia's signed and witnessed statement, the list of 174 financial transactions linked to Eric and Vanessa, a life insurance policy where the beneficiary had been changed without my knowledge. Grant turned each page, his eyes lighting up, not with glee, but with the recognition that we now had a comprehensive financial investigation file. We can send this to the state's Elder Fraud Investigation Unit. And if you agree, I will contact the insurance company directly to report the chain of related forgeries. I nodded. Do it. Then I added, I want to update my will. And the trust. Remove their names, Grant asked. Not just remove them, erase them. He sat down and opened his laptop. I dictated every sentence. I didn't stumble. I didn't hesitate. All real estate assets will be transferred to the Harold Quinn Trust, which will be used to establish a scholarship fund in my late wife's name. The Eleanor Quinn Scholarship for underprivileged young women who show leadership potential. 60% of all liquid assets will be transferred into a personal account for Julia Quinn with no guardianship restrictions. The remainder will be used to provide legal aid to elderly victims who have been exploited by their own children. Grant looked up. Are you sure I looked out the window at the morning sun on the pale gold leaves? I used to think my son was an extension of myself. But then I realized not everyone wants to be a successor. Some just want to be usurpers. That afternoon, I went home and opened my safe. The old photo was still there, me holding Eric when he was 4 with Eleanor standing beside us, her arm around my shoulder. All 3 of us were smiling. I didn't burn the photo, but for the first time I moved it to the very back of the drawer. It was no longer in the center. I would no longer replay the old memory. I wasn't suing for revenge. I was just making it clear if no one puts a stop to it, the evil in a family will be passed down through generations, without ever being called by its true name. The sky was overcast that morning. I was trimming the lavender bushes in my yard when I heard a car door slam, followed by the sound of stilettos on my stone steps like a gavel striking in a courtroom. Vanessa. I wasn't surprised. Having analyzed hundreds of behavioral profiles in my auditing career, I knew when a manipulator loses financial control, they return not to apologize but to assign blame. I set my shears down. I didn't wipe my hands. I didn't step forward. I just stood on my porch and watched her. You look comfortable, she began, her eyes red from lack of sleep or lack of control. I didn't answer. This family is falling apart. Eric can't sleep. Julia has run to your side as if we're the monsters. And you? You're drinking tea, watering your plants, like a lonely old man in his castle. I waited. You're destroying everything. Over a little money, is it just to prove you still have control over something? At the end of your life, you'll die alone, in this cold house, and no one will come to your funeral. Do you know why? Because you deserve to be forgotten, Harold. A stubborn old man clinging to his money and his fake honor. The wind gently lifted the hem of my shirt. I took one step up onto the porch. Not to threaten, just to stand a little higher enough to make her look up at me. I picked up my cold cup of tea and raised it slightly. My voice was even slow and clear. Vanessa, if peace and quiet is the price of loneliness, I'll pay it. In cash. She froze. Her face hardened. That response wasn't in the script she'd written in her head. You'll regret this. I gave a slight nod. Maybe. But if I do have regrets, they will be my own. Not something you brought over and asked me to sign for. I opened my front door. And if you don't know the way out, let me show you, because this is the last time you will ever set foot in this house. You don't have to shout to win. You just have to hold your ground and let the manipulators see that this time you will not be moved. On the last morning of the month, Julia sat across from me at the wooden table. She'd brought a laptop, a scanner, and a paper bag full of documents. No one had to say it, but we both knew this was the final family meeting of a new family. I handed Julia the new will. She didn't read it aloud. She just looked at each line, nodding slightly. When she reached the part that said, assets to be divided by the principle of dignity, not by blood, she looked up. Are you sure, Grandpa? I nodded. I'm an old man, but I've never been more sure of anything in my life. We signed. I used the old fountain pen Eleanor had given me. The nib still had that familiar metallic scent. Each stroke wasn't just a letter. It was me signing myself into my own existence. Not as a father, a husband, or a banker, but as Harold Quinn, a man who was still alive. That evening, Julia helped me set up a small camera. The angle was straight, the light was soft, and there was no background music. There was only the sound of the wind through the window, and my voice deep, steady, and needing no special effects. If someone ever calls you selfish for stopping the flow of money, know that they don't love you, they've hired you. I lived my entire life as a supporter, sending money, staying silent, saving face for others. But in the end, They didn't leave me a single drop of respect. I paused for a few seconds, looking directly into the lens. I'm not telling this story to teach anyone how to be a father. I'm telling it so that other forgotten fathers know they are not crazy. They are just too good. And sometimes being too good for too long is its own kind of sin. I turned off the camera. I didn't broadcast it. I didn't upload it. I just saved it because someday Julia might need to tell someone that she had a grandfather who didn't die in silence. I poured my tea, set it on the armrest of my chair, and wrote the final line in my notebook. They didn't think I'd do anything, but I did. Not to win, but to stop losing. You don't have to be Harold Quinn. You don't have to be a retired auditor. You don't need a file of financial records. You just need to stand up once, look directly at the person who thought you were their liability, and tell them you're no longer paying. If you've ever been taken for granted by your children, if you've ever given until you didn't know what you had left, then know this silence is a virtue, but not when it's being used to crush you. My story ends here. But if you've ever lived in a house where you were no longer called father, mother, grandfather, or grandmother, but were only remembered on the day the credit card bill was due, then remember this freedom doesn't start with revenge. It starts with the word no. People think old men are harmless, but some of us just stopped explaining ourselves. Now tell me, what would you have done if your own son forged your name?